Good morning, everyone. I think most people who registered have come in now, so we'll kick off. So today we're talking about data-driven dialogue, not just because we like alliteration and the rule of three, but just to focus on what's actually happening to the members if a scheme is going through a de-risking exercise, be that longevity or buy-in or all the way to buy-out. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to be talking about how do we master those communications to those members, the rather critical role that data plays in all aspects of that journey. And then we're going to tap a bit more into the member engagement itself and how might you go about crafting a more member-centric approach to how you deal with these rather large transactions. So I'm going to start off just by introducing myself. If you've not met me before, I tend to do a lot of industry things around data. I'm Chief Strategy Officer for Heywood, but most of my work with PASA in the industry, and even before PASA, has been on some of the things to make industry better. So things like what became the pension regulators' data and record keeping rules. More recently, the data standards for pension dashboards, and now thinking about how can we make the market a bit more seamless for schemes looking to de-risk and secure their members' benefits. So I'm now going to hand over to my fellow expert on this call, Julia.
Thanks, Chris. My name is Julia Fox. I'm a lead consultant at Quietroom. Quietroom is an insight-led communications consultancy. That means that we start with the end user. More often than not, those are pension scheme members. We start with what they need from us. We learn all about them, and then we respond to what they need. And in doing so, manage to churn out much better communications than we would if we were just doing it in a vacuum. So we're big advocates for engaging members in the right way and for using all the tools at our disposal to do it on their terms.
Excellent. Thanks, Julia. So this is going to be quite a freewheeling chat. You'll be very pleased to know that we're not going to be battering you with slideware in this webinar. Equally, to make that more freewheeling, we'd like your questions. So there is a Q&A button enabled in this particular Teams meeting. So please start throwing your questions at us. Hidden in the background is our colleague John, who's going to moderate all those questions, take out all your swear words and put them on the screen ready for Julia and I to respond to. But for now, we're going to start off with why is Chris banging on about data again? And there's two aspects to that. One of those aspects is the fact that it doesn't really matter how good Julia's words are or what our research tells us about what members want to be told and what they understand when you tell them, if the letter doesn't get there or the email doesn't arrive or any of that stuff. That's a very easy way to burn a lot of money in your project. If we start thinking about if you are going to go for a more paper-based route, and we're going to say why not later, but a more paper-based route is that every time someone tries to measure these things, time and motion, materials, anything, if you just want to write one letter to your member, it's in the region of £2.50 to £3 just to do that letter. If you talk about print, pack and post and all the work involved in getting the letter ready. Some studies in certainly some of our clients and where I've previously worked with clients who are going through a de-risking journey, if you are writing to your members, and sometimes you need to write to them, not just to communicate with them, but sometimes you're missing data. So you go and write to them and ask them for that data. Some of the response rates, you're lucky if you're getting 20%. That's a lot of money to spend on an exercise for a 1 in 5 response for the information you need. So two aspects to data then I said. So the one is making sure you've got the data in your scheme that you need for the transaction. Quite commonly, and what interviews with the insurers in the market have told us, is that the schemes don't always hold spouses information. Now, if you're going to project the future life of your pension scheme and add up all the liabilities you're ever going to owe anyone, then paying spouses once the members have died is a big chunk of your liability. So quite often when schemes are going through the process, they might have to write out to their members and ask for their marital status, marriage certificate, age of spouse, all those things that will help the actuaries calculate what the overall total liability is and what all those future cash flows look like. There are increasingly better ways of doing that. We can say the same for communication channels. We talked about paper costing a lot of money to communicate. It's also not very timely. If you imagine, and I don't know what the postal, I live in the countryside, so my postal experience is probably worse than most people's. But if I'm sending a letter, and even if I send it first class, it takes 5 days to get somewhere. The member needs to read it, engage it, assuming they're the 1 in 5 who are going to even open it and respond. And then by the time they send you something back, if it's still paper-based stuff they need to send you back, then you're easily burning 2 weeks. You're into a third week before you're actually doing anything. So cost, timeliness, not great on paper. So what are the other methods? Well, interestingly, and I think Julia might have done some research in this area as well, people actually want to be dealt with on email. People are more used to communicating that way with people they trust. Trust being the imperative word, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But there are more and more ways in which you can actually now communicate securely. So many schemes don't even hold the email address. So if we look at some of the technology solutions that are out there to help this, then there are services out there whereby you can actually go and find people's emails. You can discern whether it's a work email or a personal email. I have worked on a lot of schemes where even if they are holding the member's email address, it might be their email address for that employment. So my Heywood email address, for example. But that's no good if I leave. You're not going to be using that to communicate with them anymore. So we do need to narrow in on, can we get hold of viable, trusted personal email addresses? And the answer is yes, we can. We can find those in bulk. The other aspect is there are some things you might not to communicate the member with. And we're going to talk about communicating with members in a bit. But it's a time at which, if you're trying to communicate with them that something is happening to their pension scheme, you've got all these little behavioural hurdles to cross. They might not even know they had a pension with you. They might not know who you are. If they had a pension, it's probably locked away in the back of their mind that they've got a pension and it's safe and it's secure. They don't know what it is. They don't understand it, but they've got one. And you're out to tell them you're going to do something to it. So that might unnerve them. And then you might be admitting to them that you don't hold all the data that perhaps they thought you should. So you've got quite a lot of behavioural little glitches in the process there, if you like. Well, a lot of those we can actually go and find from trusted third-party sources now. We can go and source what we think household makeups look like. We can source spouse information. We can source the emails to communicate with them and help drive the process and reduce cost and the friction along the way. So that's really quite a step change from where we've been recently. But some of those services have been around for more than time than we've been using them for in our industry, and they are quite prevalent in other industries. So why not in pensions? So that's why we started talking about data. And just to remind you, if you want to put any questions in the chat, please do. Sorry, in the Q&A panel, I should say, not the chat. But we'll pick over some of those things. And if any of you've got any questions about how those things work, then please do throw them in. But I want to move on a little bit now to what are the reasons we communicate with members. What is the critical part of not just communicating with members, but actually engaging them? So I'll step away from data for a bit, Julia. Perhaps you want to talk about content and purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're quite right. Those behavioural changes are something we really need to look out for. People do have a tendency, certainly we found in research, and it doesn't really come as a surprise, people think of a pension, particularly a DB pension, something that is waiting in the wings, is reliable, is forever. They put that in a little box in their mind where they think, well, that's not going to change. That's something I can rely on. Introducing change into something like that, particularly when you're inundated around cost of living crisis with the idea, am I actually going to have enough in retirement? Is everything okay? Am I going to be able to pay the bills, which are rising all the time? When you introduce the idea of a change to something that you're relying on into that, it's really scary. It's also around things like de-risking exercises in DB. The opportunity for confusion is incredibly rife. The first version of any communications we tested with members around this, they picked out the words, winding up the scheme, which is a, mandated term we have to use from the regulator. But they picked that out. They got the idea, okay, the scheme's going away, this thing that's going to pay my pension. We're talking about it's going to be wound up because there are no assets left in the scheme. And an insurer has entered the scene. Maybe it's one I've heard of. Maybe it's one of the big names, or maybe it's one I've never heard of. And people were picking out these key elements of it and comparing it to the closest thing they can, which is a retailer going into administration. When you talk about a company going away that you have a relationship with and an insurer entering the scene, it usually means some kind of financial collapse. And people were assuming this, no matter how confident we were trying to make them about the subject matter, that this is a positive thing. If you go in there and just lay out the facts, the likelihood that people are going to take it the wrong way is particularly high when it comes to things like buyouts. So it's something you really need to bear in mind from the get-go. And one of the best ways of tackling this is building trust. You have to be a trusted voice. People have to believe what you're saying, know that it's definitely you. And if you, as you said, if there's data missing, or if you're not sure of data, so you don't include it, people are going to wonder if it's a scam, particularly if they don't often hear from a pension scheme. Is this definitely from them? Is this something I should be looking at? If you're asking me to engage and move my AVC benefits or something, that's got a red flag written all over it. It's great that people are really alert to potential scam flags, but it does also set us on the back foot at a time of change, particularly for a scheme that hasn't done a lot of communication in the past. So these are all things that it's one of those scenarios that you really need to think hard, have a strategy in place before you dive in there and start communicating with members about it. So there's a lot of considerations, but I think data feeds into a lot of it, because if you are that almost paternal, trustworthy group of trustees looking after something that I'm going to rely on one day, or I'm already reliant on, I'm going to need you to be in control of this and be confident. And part of that is having the information that I've shared with you and having it securely. And if you can't prove to me that you've got that and you're in control of that, it's going to already start start putting cracks in that story that we're trustworthy and in control of the situation. Oh, you're on mute, Chris.
I think after 4 years I'd have learnt that. Sorry, I was saving you from a cough earlier. Just putting onto the data thing, because a lot of what you have done and actually shared for free on your website, we'll send links later if you haven't already been on Quietroom's quite excellent material, is about the transaction, about the scheme and the nature of buying out. But actually quite a lot of the communications that schemes might need to do, if they don't avail themselves of the newer, more automated ways of gathering data from trusted third parties, if you're actually going to ask the member themselves, does that also put you at a little bit of a disadvantage when you've also got that thought that, why are they asking me this?
Yeah.
Or alternatively, the other side of that coin is, why don't you already know this?
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't you already know this is that kind of, are you as in control of this as you seem to be, or as you're trying to put across? The question of getting in touch with somebody potentially out of the blue from their perspective and asking them for secure data is something that scammers do, and it's one of the things that you're told to look out for. If someone pertaining to be us contacts you out of the blue and asks you for personal data, don't trust it. And it's great that we send those messages out. We found in research that we weren't particularly testing for this. We were testing for things like how people understand, how confident they are that they have understood what's happening during a buyout, if they are accurately getting that information through and are able to play it back accurately. We weren't really testing for do you believe this is a legitimate communication? Aside from anything else, asking that question would certainly ring alarm bells in my head. But people were offering it apropos of nothing. People were scanning information initially before getting into it. So they'd scan, say, a letter that we'd mocked up. They look for the, the member ID, the name field, the signature at the bottom, things like this. And they would scan it and say, okay, I think this would be legit. And we'd never asked that question, but people are looking for cues that something is legitimate, and they're looking to the data input to verify that. And I think that's just worth bearing in mind. As I say, it's great that people are on the alert, but we do need to then make an effort to make it clear when we're not sending out scam emails, and that we are trustworthy and that we do hold your data.
So another good reason to perhaps try and find more automated ways of hoovering up all this data rather than going directly to the members. It's a nervous time for them, I agree.
Yeah.
And actually, as we've seen with some of the results, when you do write to them and ask them for information, very few respond as well. Yeah. So what are the sort of techniques people can think about to try and improve those opening rates and response rates if they are going to do a paper journey? Or actually, even content for an email for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, it's easier with email because you can track open rates. You can see people clicking through and engaging with content. You can see, hopefully, the onward analytics, how long they spend on a page reading something. These are all ways of knowing for sure if your message is landing. When you send things out by paper, you can't know any of that stuff. You can hope for the best, or you are tracking the number of people who call, which comes with a cost itself, and hopefully people don't want to call. They feel, this is a good communication, I understand, I don't need to engage with you. The question is it a successful communication, or are people just not opening the envelope? With those those printed communications, I'd say putting things on the envelope can sometimes be helpful. You need to think about, if people aren't opening, then what can you be putting that they're going to see straight away, that they don't need to open anything to engage with? With emails, a couple of things to bear in mind will be, most often we find that people are looking at emails on their phone. What they're going to see on that smaller screen is the inbox, one of those things you overlook. Is it, one of those no reply at such and such? Because if it cuts off at no reply, you've got no idea who this is from at a glance. So can you have a name on that inbox that people are going to recognize? And then you've got, just the first few characters of the subject line. Again, action-based stuff. How do you let people know something really important's come through that we need you to engage with? I think in terms of then clicking through into the email, one of the biggest themes that's come out of testing, particularly email communications, is don't go chapter and verse. People don't expect emails to be really long form content. They're expecting big header telling you what's going on, bullet point, and then some kind of click through, ideally into a secure site if that's required, particularly if it's got member data attached to it, or through to perhaps the sponsor's website, because people may have a stronger relationship with the sponsor than they do with the scheme. Something, again, that they can check for legitimacy, that they can then cross-reference, call somebody to confirm, all those kinds of things. If you can go, here are the things you need to know in bullet point form, here's why you need to click through and engage with this, then you're going to have a much better bet of people then thinking, oh yeah, that's fine, that's something I need to know about, that's something, it's not going to take me long, because the onward journey's baked in. With letters, it's go to the website, call this number. You have to make an effort. And something else I think to bear in mind is the circumstances under which people are reading this information. It's quite common, again, this is a theme from our research, that people will look at things on their phone late at night, right before going to sleep. This is admin time for a lot of people. Climb into bed, put on the bedside lamp and think, okay, I think I got some kind of important email today. I'm just going to scan these things to see if there's anything I need to do with it tomorrow. So when you think about the context in which these messages are landing, no one's going to want to spend half an hour reading an email, and they're not, well, it's going to put them to sleep aside from anything else. If they're already in bed, that's a concern. So you need to just be punchy. Here's what you need to know. Here's what you need to do. And as I say, analytics would be huge in that scenario. If you can track how many people are reading it, that's going to be massive for knowing that your message has landed. It's an important message to land.
I think that's fair. I think it's an analogy. I saw somebody, I wish I could quote them, but someone said that if you want to teach somebody what to do in an earthquake, you don't teach them geography.
Yeah.
Just tell them to hide under the table. So it's that sort of thing, isn't it? And I do see some of the, no matter how well crafted or how well described something is, if you're trying to teach somebody pensions rather than tell them what they need to do about their pension, then you're on a little bit of a hiding to nothing. And I'm not saying education is not important, but this is a transaction we need the members to help us with. So cut to the chase, I guess, is what we'll say. Why, and classic sales. Why do I care about what you're telling me? That sort of thing.
Absolutely. It's an interesting one though. It's quite a fine line to walk with some buyout communications. So I'm thinking particularly, in the event that a scheme's left with a surplus, you got to consult with members about the use of the surplus, right? That's one where, particularly the decision is to return the surplus to the employer, simply saying, listen, we're having conversations. Here's the upshot this is the plan. If you've got strong feelings about it, let us know. That's a place where we thought, okay, let's not go into all the detail of all the conversations that are happening, the considerations, what's in the covenant. I mean, good grief, who needs to know? What they need to know is this is the plan. If you've got a problem with it, get in touch. However, that did not play well at all in testing. They needed that context, that little bit of education. Here are the options. Here's how they apply, as in some of them are written into the covenant, some of them are in the scheme rules. And then here's the character of those conversations that we're having with the sponsor. Not just saying, trust us, we're having those conversations, because you don't trust the person who says, trust me, and then says nothing else. You need to know a little bit about what the considerations have been behind closed doors. It's one of those scenarios where actually you do need to say a bit more than you would think you would need to say. And something else to bear in mind, I was thinking when you're talking, particularly about spouse data, a lot of buyout communications we found required a little bit of context setting at the beginning. When you first send out the first communication about this, people could have multiple DB pensions, right? You need to do a little bit of, okay, so when you worked for this company, you accrued benefits. That's the bit that we're talking about. Acknowledge the fact that you might have lots of pensions. And it's particularly important with spouses who may not have worked that job and may not have heard anything about it, seen anything about it in their lives. Hopefully, you would have the data to be able to say when name of member passed away, benefits were, to be able to, again, relay in human terms who are the people that we're talking about? What are the circumstances under which you accrued these benefits? Which bit of benefits are we talking about? That was really important for all the people we tested with. It's particularly important with spouses. So you should have their data, but you should also connect it with the member data so that you can relay back to them. And also so that you don't have to say things like, when your loved one dies, we don't know if they were a loved one. We don't know the circumstances. If, and again, husband and wife, we don't know if they were married or if they had a civil partnership. You should be able to use names and not make assumptions about people, because it's not always appropriate.
I think that's fair. And that probably brings us on to a slightly more broader point is, you don't have to write one letter for the entire scheme, do you? There's an opportunity for personalisation here. No,
and you shouldn't really write one letter for everybody. Aside from anything else, it would be a very long letter. Those, so if you haven't started taking a pension yet, this, if you have started this, if you're actually the spouse of a deceased member, this, again, it doesn't really build much confidence that you've had to do a broad strokes thing. Don't you know, who I am? Aren't you speaking to me directly? Can't you acknowledge that? So it's a little bit about trust, but it's just practical as well. If you can segment the membership, you can just get straight to the point, and people will just relate to it much better than they would to a really generic statement. You can find a generic statement about big changes on websites and things, and you expect them to be quite generic. But when you communicate with somebody directly, that shouldn't be a generic statement. That should be targeted at the person you're speaking to, really.
Yeah. And I guess depending on the quality of your data, you could even get down to a segment of one if you know it that well, that you know that person's exact circumstance, and more likely to engage, and B, to think this can't be a scam. They know too much about me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you mentioned web, and I keep saying letter, but of course, you know, there's so much more mileage, cost saving, speed of process that we can get from converting to email. What's interesting is that we are running, Heywood, are running a pilot on secure email at the moment, because the technology exists. I mean, it's not a technology problem. It's actually a behavioural challenge to say, can we get people comfortable that this is secure enough? Because the benefits are immense. I mean, just to give you a small example, you know, you can go address data, email address data, you can get all of this. You get reports on degrees of confidence that you know it's that person's email address, all those good things to give you confidence that you have the data to then go on your journey. And in almost every circumstance I've just described there, it's cheaper than a stamp. You know, it's not even cheaper than the whole letter at £2.50 or whatever. It's cheaper than just the stamp to go and do that sort of work. And then once you've got it, you can use one of which being checking that the members are okay with you doing that. That's when you actually think about, what do I say in the email? You can't really treat the email in isolation, can you? Because that will look like a scam, no matter how well written it is. So what else do people need to think about? I mean, short of a full long strategy, and we'll come on to strategy before we finish, but short of the full strategy, what do people need to think about in terms of how I communicate, and what should I say in each bit? You mentioned websites just now, so that's what reminded me to ask you.
Yeah, I think the secure login section, I think, is really important. In some ways, it's an extra step. Really, ideally, you just want to say everything up front, but actually it's introducing the extra step does improve people's impression of the security of it. Because if you are required to log into a separate website, there's a higher chance that it's the legitimate, particularly if you log into it regularly for your communications. I will say, I mean, I think there's a good example of this. It almost feels like a more onerous process in one sense that actually makes things easier. Monzo do this. They recently, I don't know if you've seen any of their messages about how to spot and avoid a scam. Their position is, Monzo is primarily, it's an app. There's no website you can log into. They don't communicate by post. That's not the way they do things. They have an app. So when they need to contact customers, they use the in-app chat function. And then what their anti-scam messages have been is, if someone calls you out the blue and says they're from Monzo, first thing you can do is you open the app, because you have to securely sign in. And what the person on the phone will do, if they are legitimately from Monzo, is they'll start a chat with you in that secure app. And the name in the chat will match the name of the person on the phone. And they may well say, I'm going to write this in the chat. So you'll see it. So you know that that person is legitimate. They say that's what you should challenge. Every person who speaks to you from Monzo, you challenge them to do that. If they can't do that, they're not from Monzo. So introducing that, we have a secure area where we can guarantee it's you that we're speaking to, and you can guarantee it's us. So, you know, if you've got those secure pension websites, whether it's, you know, administrator hosted or hosted in-house, somewhere where people can log in, you know it's them, and they know that it's you, because a scammer can't tell you to go to a secure area to communicate, because they lose you at that point. So it is, I think, worth not putting all the information up front, in case also this person's email has been compromised at some point. and they need to give you a new email, you have to take them through to a secure area where all that information is available. And again, if you can just track the click-through rate, if anything's not working for people, if they're not clicking through, it's good to know, is it because they think, oh, I'll get to that, and then they forget all about it? Doing it in the moment is always better. Or is there something that is raising red flags with them? Is there something they don't want to engage with? If again you can use member research, member data to support that, then you can adjust your messages or send a follow-up and just absolutely tackle head on. Few people have been getting to this is a really important message. Things are about to change. We need you to engage with this. It's just really it's using technology to almost emulate that face-to-face conversation again, you know, to go back to, you just can't guarantee that if you send something out into the wide universe that somebody's engaging with it in the way that you want them to. You can use, you know, data and research as we have done to give it the best possible chance of doing so. But you can't track a letter in an envelope. You just don't know what the onward journey is there.
That's a good point, because I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of something very official. If you're writing a letter, or even taking the mindset of writing a letter into writing an email, but it tends to be sort of more of a pronouncement and a lot of legal stuff and caveats, and you feel like you have to get everything out there because it's written down, it's important and possibly actionable. But actually, an email is the start of a conversation, not here's an edict. So I think you're right. It's an absolute change in style to think about there. And then, you know, probably tenfold again, if you're in push messaging with an app, people are engaging with something. You've actually got that human behavioural switch, that because it's in their phone and their phone is in their hand.
Yeah,
it's more tangible to them rather than just. I mean, email's pretty tangible, as you say, because we pretty much nearly always use that on our phones rather than our computer screens. What I found interesting, and it's very timely, because I think it was you guys only put this out this week. You got the current report on digital inclusion, or the digital gap between those who are excluded. And I did read into a lot of the detail. Is that a lot of this actually plays back to a lot of people lack the skills to go online and do something, but actually the gap is much smaller when it's email on a phone. You know, people seem to have learned how to do that part. So I think it does lend weight to using email as a channel, because you might be including people who for the skew area on the website that you mentioned. Whilst I agree that's the perfect place to do some of the follow-on, there's no reason why you can't use the email to encourage them to register and go online and sell them the benefits of doing that. So it does feel like, you know, the increased use of email securely, if we can get over the trust concerns, you know, gives you that better view than paper, for all sorts of reasons. But I think you're right. You still need to think about, I can't send this email out of context. So what we've had to do in setting up for our own proof of concept that we're doing on secure email is have everything, I feel like, supporting network around it, you know, almost a bit like scaffold or a support network, whichever way you want to visualize this. Because there are lots of reasons why we are already communicating with scheme members, not least of which benefit statement at some point during the year. And perhaps you don't do that proactively for deferred members today. Perhaps this might be another reason to start thinking about that. Pension dashboards require you to produce these numbers anyway. So if you're not already producing them automatically for deferred members, then that's just another reason to be doing it anyway. It would also help you in a position for when you're going to de-risk later, if that's what you're going to do. So there's lots of reasons why you start sort of bringing up the level of data that's available, be it personal data, contact data, benefit data. Just bringing the levels up are going to reap your benefits later. But if you are communicating with them and something's coming up, what we found in our proof of concept was that you still probably have to communicate with them to say, we're trying to move to email. We know most of you want to work with email. We don't always hold your email. So if you can go online and tell us what it is, that's brilliant. Otherwise, you know, we'll try and find another way. But it's always in your control. You can always choose whether you want to work with email or not. All those great messages, that sort of thing. You've also typically got to put something on your own website for people who do go, and it doesn't need to be in a secure area if you're just telling people what's going on.
Yeah.
It might be a little bit of an alert to scammers if they're, hoovering up to say, oh, so-and-so is going through a de-risking exercise, let's go and email all their members. You've got to balance that risk. But at least you tell your members in a way that something's going on, we'll be in touch with you when you get it. Please, with all things, be careful, but you can trust this one. There's a slight parallel. We worked on the user research testing for dashboards when I was at MAPS. And what came across more than anything, and I think this plays back to your envelope conversation earlier, Julia, is that people trusted that HMG logo of some sort. They recognised officialdom in some way.
Yeah.
Now, we can't lean back on officialdom for government, but it's also why, Money Helper at MAPS is probably predicted to be the most used dashboards once they're all up. Yeah. Because there are people who don't engage with financial services institutions of any stripe, but trust the government. Might not trust politicians, but they trust government. So again, you've got to get into that position of trust as a scheme. And as we said, some of that is just writing the right way. Some of that is making sure that you can't just send an email out of the blue and just go, hello. But also how, you know about the members, and the more you can show that you know about them, then the less likely you come across as a scammer. Still not seeing any Q&A, so please remember if you want to ask us anything while we're both on, then please do so. Unless you've all been putting swear words in your questions, and John just can't publish any of them. But just want to move on just at the end, Julia, just talk about how, if you're crafting the whole strategy. So we've talked about the reason why you just can't email somebody out of the blue.
Yeah. Because
you've got trust issues, risk of scams, all that good stuff. So bearing that in mind, and also pulling together what we've just been talking about in terms of multi-channel, what are your sort of top tips for actually crafting the whole strategy?
Yeah, so I think there's probably something else to throw into the why you can't just default to email straight out of the gate and assume it's all going to go well. So at the moment, because schemes are so much more likely to have address data than they are email data, the regulator sees that as the more reliable way to reach the greatest number of members. Now, contradicting that thought is that you can't track if they're being opened, if they're being read. If a scheme has and can show it's got great email address data, and that it is for those people who have said, I'd rather you just communicated with me by email, then that is the right way to communicate with those people. So the regulator specifies that you are communicating with people in a way that is reliable to reach them, but also is to their preference wherever possible. So a lot of communications in the buyout journey at the moment are mandated to go out by post on the assumption that you must have address data that's better than your email data. So unless you can show otherwise, you're kind of a little bit hamstrung there by the regulations. It's all well-meaning, but it's based on what we hope is going to be sort of an outgoing situation, which is that you probably know someone's address better than you know how to email them. So that's something else to bear in mind. At the moment, some of those notices are required to go out by post unless you can say, no, these people prefer email and we've got their email addresses. So that's how we did it. And that ticks all those boxes for the regulator. In terms of the strategy, that's a big part of it. Let's start out. What channels can we use? What do these communications look like? We find that one of the best things you can do, in fact, probably the best thing you can do, is start with the members. Is there any data that you can gather? Not just about how they want to be communicated with, but messages they understand, messages they don't understand. We learned a lot when testing our own. So it's a toolkit of buyout communications we produced. This was particularly for those schemes who have lower budget, who can't, create a strategy from scratch and then tailor it. That's all baked into this suite of communications to make sure that they hit the mark as well as possible. We tested them really rigorously, and there were things in that testing that surprised us. I think testing will always surprise you. And I think the only way to write a strategy that is adaptable, that doesn't, say this is the only way of doing things, this is the only way of communicating, no matter what communications you have ahead, it needs to be adaptable, flexible, and just member driven. You start by finding out what members need from you. That then becomes your strategy because you have to meet those user needs. And then in terms of when things change, so ideally you'll have tracking, right? Again, I'm imagining ideally this is email going onto digital, so you're able to track how members use information. That gives you, what we call quantitative metrics, which is page views, click-through rates, things that tell you how members are behaving. Qualitative data is why they're doing those things, why members are behaving that way. Ideally, you'll have both. So if there's a sudden surge in people going through to the website, if suddenly loads and loads of people stop reading your emails, whatever, a change in the data, if you see that, ideally, you'll be able to go and find out what's driving that behavior. Have people heard some bizarre rumor and they're surging to the website to find out whether or not it's true? Have people stopped reading your emails because the subject lines just aren't motivating them to open them? Things like that. If you can find out why, then if your original strategy was based on member behavior, member data, and then you track changes in it, then the strategy naturally moves with it, because you think, well, now we need to respond to this change in the data, right? Now we need to do something different. And really the only successful strategy is one that starts with your audience, addresses their needs, and then can adapt and flex. Otherwise, you'll find yourself creating new strategies constantly to try to deal with short-term issues, which is not the most cost effective. I mean, it's great for Quietroom if you're coming to us for every strategy, don't get me wrong, but you really want to build something that is, responsive, flexible to not just to what you want, what you need as a scheme, what the sponsor needs, none of that. It's what your members need, how that aligns with what you need to tell them, and then how you can adapt to changes in member requirements over time. So I think that would really be, in terms of really practical steps, I'd say gather all the data you have, start with understanding your members as well as you possibly can, and then respond to that. It tends to almost produce itself at that point, because you get those priorities, you get what members need. So I think practically, if you can start with contact information and so forth, you've already started off well. And it's not onerous. I know people are like, oh, research, that takes months. And then what if we find out something that's going to cost a fortune to respond to? It's actually, things have moved on. We do really quick and dirty research at Quietroom that is really data rich. We often get results overnight for stuff. It's really quite easy these days.
Tim's actually raised a question, and sorry for anyone who's been raising questions. They've apparently a slight delay in them coming up on our screens. So I think this is a really good example of personalisation for slightly different reasons. Tim's asking us, what benefit is there in preparing communications that allow for disability, for example, dyslexia? I think I broadened that slightly because I know in my previous role we did quite a lot of work around vulnerability as well. And there's obviously some difficulties in holding data for why people need a certain way of treatment. But actually you can record that they need that certain bit of treatment. So certainly the admin platforms I work with, you can record that somebody needs something in a slightly different format, for example. You don't need to know why, you just need to know what they need from you. So your experiences in those areas of people with differing needs?
Yeah, absolutely. It may or may not be, an accessibility and ability thing. It could just be that that's how people prefer to consume information because they're doing 5 other things at once. It's again, I think starting with understanding members gets you closer to it. If you look to the language of the consumer duty around DEI in communications, what it says is that you are creating communications that work for everyone, regardless of levels of ability, of different needs. You definitely should find out. You start with your members. What do you need from us? Do you prefer email? Do you prefer letters? But also, are there other formats we can provide this in? Some people are always going to want to speak to a person. And that's not necessarily an ability thing. That's how some people, you know, the different learning styles, when they say some people are visual learners, some people absorb information by being like, I can see I've received an important communication. My need now is to pick up the phone and ask somebody at the administration team to tell me what it is. As long as you're making all of these available to people really upfront, there's a lot of things we do around English as a second language as well, because English is a very idiomatic language. We use these turns of phrases, these metaphors that do not translate and are really difficult to learn. Those are the kinds of things, again, you start by avoiding them. And ideally, if you're testing language, you're seeing where your blind spots are. Like, something might not be an issue for you, but it might be for your reader. So, I mean, it's a repeated refrain, but start with your members, talk to your members, and do what they need, not just what you think they need. And you're never going to go far wrong.
Excellent. I'll just wrap up on that, Tim, because of my other observation, and this is something that comes from our own inclusivity team in our software design team, is that there's no losers if you design to be inclusive. And you like with that, there's an analogy, I can't remember what the American phrase is, but in the UK we'd call it the dropped curb analogy. So there are wider benefits to dropping curbs on pavements beyond just wheelchair users. It helps cyclists, it helps women with pushchairs, or anything else you're trying to do. And as I jokingly said in a conference once, also means I don't trip up when I leave the pub. But there's lots of if you design inclusivity first, then nobody loses. Getting quite close to the end of our time now, so I just thought I'd recap on some of the things we've talked about today. I think the resounding message that came through to me, Julia, is that for lots of reasons, engagement, avoiding that risk of feeling like you're being scammed, all that sort of thing, just comes down to a classic refrain in personalization, which is show them you know them.
Yep.
To be the key message through this. And of course, if you're not holding the right sort of data that you need, either for the transaction or for the communication, then you can't really show them you know them. And that, if we get one thing away from our last nearly hour, perhaps that's the one to finish with. Yeah,
and it's expensive not knowing people as well. We often hear people say, oh, we can skip the research phase. We know kind of best practice. We kind of know our members, it's fine. We've seen when that doesn't work, hopefully it's not an issue, but occasionally we've worked with schemes who've communicated on those assumptions, have had to stop a buyout because of the member response, an overwhelmingly negative sort of panic response. Something's changing quickly and I don't have that ownership over it. I don't understand it well enough. They have had to literally stop and then bring us in to do sort of re-communication, where you start again and say, okay, so here's what we didn't say last time. And also, it drives calls. If people aren't sure if something's a scam, they might call. That's always recommended, that you call the line that you're used to calling, the administrator, whoever. And that comes with a cost association as well. You can actually, in our experience, reduce costs by knowing people up front, knowing how to communicate with them, and then everything goes easier. And aside from anything else, it's a better experience for members. And in an industry where it's our duty to look out for members, and where increasingly regulators are requiring us to prove that we're doing everything we can, then there is no better way to start than by showing people. And that starts with actually knowing people. So yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Thanks, Julia. Thanks for your time today. My watch is telling me it's time to stand up, so it must have overrun slightly. So I hope you enjoyed today. If you have asked questions and they've just been slow coming through to us, then we'll get you answers after the call. But just a reminder that all of this knowledge has been distilled into handy websites and PDFs. Some links on the screen for you. So do engage, to have a look at what we've done. If you've got any questions for us, then I'm sure by now you know where to find Julia and I. We're hardly shrinking violets. Got any queries, please contact. But I hope you enjoyed this morning. And
Thanks,
with
Chris.
that,
Thanks,
I wish
everyone.
you, thanks, Julia, and have a very pleasant day, everyone. See you.